Hi. I hope you enjoyed these two films. If you're just joining us now or came late or maybe tuning in digitally at a later date, we just watched Flora Gomez's The Blue Eyes of Yonta, directed by her in 1992. And we also watched The Diary of an African Nun by Julie Dash. We're now going to have a conversation, talk back between curator Yasmina Price and Dr. Jaimee A. Swift. Dr. Jaimee A. Swift is the executive director and founder of Black Women Radicals, a Black feminist advocacy organization dedicated to uplifting and centering Black women and gender-expansive people's radical activism in Africa and the African diaspora. Swift is also the creator and founder of the School for Black Feminist Politics, which has a mission of empowering Black feminisms in politics by expanding the field from transnational, intersectional, and multidisciplinary perspectives. Yasmina Price is a New York-based writer and film programmer completing a PhD at Yale. She's devoted to visual culture from the African continent and diaspora, anti-colonial cinema, and the experimental work of women filmmakers. Her programming has been featured at Anthology Film Archives, Light Industry, Maisels, eFlux, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, among others. Her writing has appeared in edited volumes and museum catalogs with essays in The Nation, The Baffler, Movies Notebook, Criterion, and Film Quarterly, among many others. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jaimee A. Swift and Yasmina Price to the stage.
Good evening.
Hello.
Thank you, Dani, for that introduction and for being such a wonderful collaborator. And to Jaimee,
Thank you
for joining us tonight. Because both your work, I think really as someone who is an institution builder for legacies of Black women thinkers and militants is really exceptional. And I would say that the spirit of this program also has everything to do with what this institution of Black culture for Black people upholds, which is our histories of culture as our histories of resistance, as our histories of survival, because what I think all of us know in our bones and know in our heads is that the violence of colonization and the violence of enslavement was both one that was territorial, it was one that was physical, it was one that was a brutality of labor, but it was also very much one that was about an act of cultural violence, of separating us from each other, and through that from our practices of storytelling, of spirituality, of cooking, of being, of dancing, and so much of what has been a narrative of continual life in the face of those structures of death has really been refusing those separations and refusing those fragmentations and weaving ourselves back together again and again. And that is very much what I think both Julie Dash is doing in her beautiful 1977, The Diary of an African Nun, and what Flora Gomes also did with The Blue Eyes of Yonta. So just to say a little bit about the connection between the two films, it is the way in The Diary of an African Nun, we see how the central character is wrestling between this kind of cultural displacement, because on the one hand, she's been called to become a nun, and we have that presented very much in the whiteness of the nun's habit, and then she's also being called by the sounds of the drums back to her village. So it's not only a crisis of faith, it's also a crisis of culture and a crisis of belonging. And then in the other film, which takes place in Guinea-Bissau after the War of Liberation has been won, is this really serious question of how you keep that revolution going when you have a condition of economic dependency that is also one of cultural dependency, which is so, I think, delightfully written into this love letter that a young Ghanaian man writes to a young Ghanaian woman, but that has to pass through the image of blue-eyed Swedish girls. And so Jaimee, because I know that you work very much in the shared geographies of both of these films, and definitely across the Atlantic, across what we unhappily call the Lusophone regions. Unhappily, because they were colonized by Portugal. I wonder if there's something there that you would like to start with.
Yeah, well, thank you once again, Yasmina, for having me, and Daniela for coordinating, curating everything. I think what is particularly interesting about Flora Gomes's film, The Blue Eyes of Yonta, is that when we think about the context of post-colonial Guinea-Bissau, you also have to think of the Portuguese Empire and the political ideologies of the Portuguese Empire. And so one of the things that they're contending with is this political pseudoscientific ideology of lusotropicalism, which was actually catalyzed by a Brazilian sociologist by the name of Gilberto Freire. And so this ideology stated that because the Portuguese was more benevolent and could adapt to warmer climates, they were not as racist as particularly the U.S. in terms of strict. Yes, in terms of strict Jim Crow laws, right, in the U.S. So their argument was that because of the miscegenation of particularly indigenous people, European peoples, and African peoples, because of this racial mixing, what Gilberto Freire called racial democracy, there was no necessarily racist structures. It was on the basis of class, right, instead of race. And so you see how people are contending with this, especially with Cabral. He was a main critic of lusotropicalism and how it turned them into agents of paradise instead of really the fight against these pseudoscientific ideologies that govern how people moved, how people sought to see themselves. And so you see this in the context of Flora Gomes as well. And also we see what was going on within these African nations fighting for independence, right? While Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, many others were fighting against Portuguese colonial rule. In Brazil, there was a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. So you have these Portuguese colonies rising up, right? But then what happens after, and what are the consequences of rising up? And in many cases, we see that many Black people, whether on the African continent or in Brazil, which houses the largest Black population in the African diaspora, they're still on the bottom of the socioeconomic political totem pole. So racial democracy is a farce. Lusotropicalism is a farce. And so we see this in this context.
Yeah, and as you said, Cabral was such a critic of that, and Cabral really, in a way, almost haunts cinema that is made in those areas of the African continent, whether it's in the films of someone like Sarah Maldoror, who herself was Franco-Guadeloupean, but also was the partner of Mario de Pinto de Andrade, so herself spent a lot of time in Angola, but also in Cabo Verde and in Guinea-Bissau. And actually, Flora Gomes started out as her camera assistant. And Cabral, amongst many things, was really one of the great thinkers of the importance of culture to revolution, because he saw that culture was ultimately a reflection of what was going on in the socioeconomic material conditions of a country. So when it was a nation state that was fighting for its liberation and fighting to be free, culture would have to be a front of that as well. So he's actually the one who sends Flora Gomes, along with 3 other young Ghanaians, to Cuba to be trained there in filmmaking. They return, and then this is one of the films he made. And I think something else that I was thinking about as you were speaking is also that question of what do you do after you win the War of Liberation is also, because there's several romances happening in that film. There's the obvious one that's happening with Yonta, there's the one with Zay, but there's also the kind of romance of revolution and what you do with this really seductive story that you have fought for and that you have made real, but in a way gets stuck, which I think is also what is so incredible with that opening with the kids running with the tires that have all of these dates of important moments in the history of Guinea. And I even think about the fact that they're tires, so they're rotating. So that's also telling us this history isn't going in a straight line. This history is going in circles. This history is propelled by kids running along behind and beside it, but it kind of keeps repeating.
Yes. No, and I think about how we even present day, we romanticize our movements and not realizing the bodily, psychological threat and terror that our ancestors and people who are present day political prisoners have gone through, right? When we romanticize revolution, I think about Assata Shakur. We were just talking about her, rest in peace and power to her. But what it would be like, we romanticize her flight, her marronage, her maroonage to Cuba, but she was not able to be seen or to be able to walk around, or because she was always in hiding. And so I think about this context of these little children romanticizing Vicente and his role in the revolution, but not realizing he's trying to run a business and
trying to sell some fish.
Sell some fish, right? And the fish are rotten, and like the women are beating up his colleagues, you know. And so, what does this mean in the context of revolution? And also with Yonta, who is kind of seduced by, you know, Western and European, you know, aesthetic and culture, him denying his love for her in a sense because he wants to be, you know, connected or tethered to revolution, but realizing that he no longer is in this position.
Absolutely.
And so it's these contradictions, but also like, how do we move forward from the romanticizing of this to understanding where we are today, and what strategies do we need to go back to be employed present day?
Absolutely.
In the context we're in.
And the kind of lessons that we can learn. And I think one of them is that one of the dangers in that process of myth making is often that we make singular myths and we make singular figures. It's not only the history of the colonizer that is often told as a history of great men. We do that with our Black histories as well. So I think it also is important that in the same way as Gomes does with his really stunning earlier film Mortu Negra, and Bisa Gomes, who plays the mother, is the central character in that earlier film that he made, so Mortu Negra, or Those Who Death Refused. And he places a woman at the center of both of those narratives. I think it's interesting that in this one, she's the carrier of the one who is seduced by the European dream, and it is the men who carry, I guess, a clearer commitment to the revolutionary struggle. But then with Dash's film as well, that part of the logic of the pairing is also looking at these narratives that place Black women at the center of how we tell history and how we look at history, and not just Black women as symbols, but Black women with complex interiorities. And I think what's really stunning with Dash's translation of that Alice Walker story is that on the one hand, Barbara O. Jones is so beautiful, and she only passed away last year, and she's someone whose face is going to be recognizable if you're familiar with the film history of the LA Rebellion, which was made on the West Coast in the 60s and 70s. They were really working through a third worldist, Black rebellious commitment to filmmaking as a practice of revolution, and Barbara O. Jones appears in so many of those films, but part of the work that Dash is doing is also finding a visual language that makes Black women not just objects, not just exteriors, whether it's exteriors that are being denigrated or exteriors that are being praised, but that she's someone who has this rich inner struggle that she's working through, and that is also connected with Dash's earlier work in Daughters of the Dust.
I was going to bring up Daughters of the Dust because in that film you have two granddaughters going back to Igbo Island of Gullah Geechee culture and origin, and one converted to Christianity and the other one is still finding her way, but they have to consult with their grandmother, who is the keeper of their ancient secrets in terms of their African traditional religions. And so you have one granddaughter trying to convert her family members to Christianity, and the push and pull of that, and you can see that in the Diary of the African Nun, where you hear the drumming and her like pacing back and forth and wondering if she should be, you know, pious and not go back to this I guess, in the savage way of life, and how do you reconcile with that, with once again the consequences of colonialism, and knowing where you come from and knowing that there's some interiority there, but then refusing that.
Yeah.
And so I think about this in the context of Brazil. Under Portuguese colonialism, it was banned for you to practice African traditional religions during enslavement, right? So you had people who were taking their African traditional religions and syncretizing them with Catholic saints, and they called this candomblé, Afro-Brazilian religion. There's also Umbanda, there's Kimbanda. But there was a woman, she was a Iyalorisha of candomblé, a priestess of candomblé. Her name was Mai Stella Giaxoshi, and she said, no longer will we adhere to syncretizing these Catholic saints with Orishas. We're not doing that anymore. They were there for a purpose. She was like, I have no problem with the Catholic Church, but the problem is we have our own African Black deities that we worship. And so when do we move away from the syncretism? When do we move away from the aesthetics and the politics of European powers to our own internal and political, social, cultural power?
Yeah.
And so that reminded me of that stance that she was trying to convey in the Diary of the African Nun.
And even knowing that that was banned shows how much it was considered a danger by colonial authorities. And the same thing happens on the African continent, where, for example, in the former French colonies, there's something called the Laval Decree that actually makes it illegal for an African person to have a camera in their hands. So it's not for nothing that there was such a concerted effort to separate Black people from their cultural traditions. It was from an understanding that that was also where the seeds of rebellion were brewing. And something that I always think with the Haitian Revolution is that the Haitian Revolution begins with Voodoo. It begins with ritual, something that creates the first Black republic that is, I think, the most significant revolution that happens across the globe, is one that doesn't begin with a military action. It begins with a spiritual communion. And I think even thinking of the place of drums in all of our interconnected continental diasporic histories, drums have been used as part of celebratory practices, religious practices, but they've also been these kinds of mechanisms of survival, of communication across space, and that in the kind of incantation in Dash's film, it won't go away. Like, it almost like I feel like you feel more like you are in her head because of that drumming.
And I also think about how, you know, the denial of our ways of expression and culture and religiosity and politics, for it to be branded by Europe, like white folks now, as like a tourism or aspect. I remember going to Brazil, Salvador several times, and seeing the word ashe all over the buses, all over like paraphernalia. And I'm like, you're using a Yoruba term of ashe as a life force to profit off Black people who you denied their access to and their right to practice their own self and their own religiosity and ways of being. And I wonder just how once again, the consequences of getting back to oneself, but then at the same time, the co-optation and pacification of our movements, our stories, our histories, our archives, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's something that we're seeing happening arguably faster than ever. Like, it's either outright censorship and repression, or it's something that has felt more and more like a framework for me to try to understand things, is that we keep getting our chains sold back to us as freedom, and that happens again and again. I think, to say again, the paramount importance of institutions like the Schomburg, because the only way we can have the clarity of being able to see the difference between the thing that is actually liberation on our own terms and the thing that is a partial freedom that's meant to pacify us is when we have that kind of long arc of history. And I think even the very early on in the film, I think it's Vincente who says, remembering is uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Because it's hard to reckon with the fact that these histories of rebellion and ongoingness are also full of betrayal and are full of grief and are full of pain.
And it's a form of possibility. And I think that now we need to hold on to that possibility now more than ever, as we see surveillance and oppression, repression of the radical lefts and Black and brown voices of folks who are just being taken, right? We have to hold on that remembering is also a form of possibility, and remembering that if this can be done, then another world is possible as well.
Absolutely, and that the commitments we have to each other are so old.
Exactly.
And we haven't, we never break them completely, and as long as something is still connected, we still have that. And I know a thinker that we both hold dear, Beatriz Nascimento,
Exactly.
Who is an Afro-Brazilian historian, militant, poet, dancer, thinker, mother, whose profound commitment to the history of quilombos in Brazil was really to think about them as a form of continuity, that the thing we have as an antidote is to keep returning to those older practices.
Exactly, and to quote her, like, wherever the quilombo is, I am. And so we have a responsibility to create maroons, the quilombos, the palenques, the macambos, wherever we are, this radical third space, the citizenship schools, the freedom schools. That's what we need today, because we also know that these institutions have never wanted us. And so how do we keep that concept of liberation amongst ourselves going?
Which I can say again, Jaimee is really a model of upholding that. If any of you aren't familiar with her work with Black women radicals, it really is a materialization of that kind of education, of that kind of coming together. And I know that there's some events in New York, there's online events all the time. I don't know how she does it.
I don't know how you do it, girl.
We're tired. And I think with that, we are going to hand it over to you if you have any questions, comments.
Okay, hi. So I'm gonna try to keep this as short as possible. Revolution looks very different based on the time period, based on where you are. And I guess my question is, in this time period, specifically, I guess in the United States, what does revolution look like? In the film, we could see that I'm sorry for forgetting his name, but he was very still stuck in the time of like the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau, and like Yonta had to tell him, like, you're here now, like you can't just be married to this thing. And I guess like I feel like revolution has so many things to, like, I guess, checks and balances that have to go into it. So how do you navigate not being like, you know, that stereotype of like an ivory tower academic who just like, you know, just thinks about revolution, discusses revolution, but never really engages. But then also on the other end, there are some people who are a little bit more reactionary. They want to LARP as a revolutionary, so they just want to, you know, their thing is all about like, ooh, like the guns and like the violence and this and everything like that. And they don't understand that this current like time, it's not necessarily revolution isn't gonna look like the Haitian Revolution right now in 2025 in America. That's not how it's gonna look like if we want to ever get somewhere. So how do you like, I guess, how do you breathe in, I guess, all the right elements for what we would consider actual revolutionary change? Thank you.
Thank you. What you said about, like, you know, these ivory tower academics, and listen, speaking about revolution and abolition, but not being amongst the people in a way, it reminds me of what Assata Shakur said in her autobiography about, I just couldn't be in like the library reading books, right? I had to be amongst the people. And I think it takes both those practices of not necessarily being in the ivory tower, but political education and political organizing amongst your community. I also think that it's important to have intergenerational conversations with people, with our elders who have been doing this work for a very long time. We still have members of the Black Panther Party with us. We still have members of the Young Lords Party with us. We still have members of the Combahee River Collective, a Black lesbian feminist socialist organization founded in the 1970s with us. What is that? There's people who are your neighbors, who are elders, that can attest to some of the activism and movement work that they did. What does that look like to bridge those gaps? Not necessarily in an academic space, but in a freedom school model, a third space to do this type of work. And I think that is where political consciousness comes in, right? And then the political consciousness turns into political education, and that political education turns into political organizing. And so another thing I think that breaks us up in this regard is social media in this way, right? I think a lot of times we are siloed in these positions looking on our phone. What does it look like to go to a food bank or to organize mutual aid and really connect with people on the ground? As my colleague Crew Makedo, founder of Black Lesbian Archive, said, what if the government shuts off our internet? Who will we have? What are we going to do? And we're going to need each other. And so I think that, I hope that answers your question.
I think what I'll add briefly to Jaimee's beautiful answer is that a lot of it is a humble commitment to experimenting together. It's a surrender to the fact that it is also uncertain. We have a lot to draw on, but we also don't have a map out of this, and it's going to be uncomfortable and uncertain, and everyone will have to make sacrifices and compromises and also hold on to our commitments, and we have each other.
Exactly.
And that's it.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Caitlin, and I'm curious about what you both think about time in both of the films, because I think in The Diary of an African Nun, the chant in the background or the dance that she's referring to is like a ring circle, like a ring shout, because she says that the first person that starts in the middle of a circle is a girl. And I'm thinking about, obviously, Yonta, and she's wearing a clock. And when she's wearing a clock, that's like the site of where it's almost equivalent to like, whenever she's walking on the street, like sex work, like she's kind of being like seen as like, she's objectified more when she's wearing a clock. Because you don't see the guys trying to get her attention. They ask her what time it is, like, and we think about time as money. So I'm thinking about like the currency that's tied to her body when she wears the jewelry. And the ring shout, the African ring dance, is about like time travel. And I'm thinking about how in the Blue Eyes, the Blue Eyes film, that the dates of freedom change. So it's like the revolution started in 1977, but then it was 73, then it was 74, and then it was like the 1991, and then it's like, what about the 2000s? So I'm just really thinking about like these time in both films, because at the end of the Yonta, the past I'm thinking is Vicenci, in the future, like modernity is I think Zane, the poet, right? As he's the driver, he's no longer a fisherman. But like she's in the middle, her clock stopped. So she's in like the middle of both of these things. So where is she? So yeah, sorry, that was long.
It's okay.
I mean, I think you answered the question really well, to be honest. Yeah. I think I would agree with you, because I think a lot of what you were saying is that there's this kind of ongoing, repeated, cyclical time that doesn't have a clean line around it, that doesn't have a definitive endpoint or a definitive beginning point. And I think that even goes to that earlier question, that all of this is ongoing all the time. And it's a practice, and it's a rehearsal, and you keep rehearsing over and over. Thank you.
Thank you. You got it. Okay, Doc. Okay.
I think we have time for one more question, one last question to close it out.
I suppose it's more of a comment now because it was quite similar to theirs. I had noticed, and my name's Naja, I had noticed in both of the films that time took essence because the nun, she saw herself wanting to be a part of the Catholicism. And then also in terms of the lady in the other film, when she had the clock on, the time was moving in the film. We knew that they weren't aging, but we saw that something was happening. And even when the man, he kept asking, and I think it was like a radio announcement, they were like, oh, where is he? Like, have you seen him? And the people in the back room were looking for him. I was just like, wow, like, this is very interesting to see, like, the parallel in terms of how time is moving. And then there was someone that had the first question, I just wanted to, like, make a comment on that. I work for the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and we're having a Protect Black Migrants Week of Action this week. So if you are looking for anything to like support Black people and like Black solidarity, we're gonna have an event in Brooklyn this Saturday. But yeah, so this is a very nice event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Swift. Thank you, Yasmina.
Thank you.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. And please join us for the next iteration of Yasmina's season, which will be on November 18th. We'll be spotlighting movement leaders and everyday people with Lumumba, The Death of a Prophet, and Selbo, one among many. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Well,